From the 30-ton Soviet tank found deep in a river to paintings worth over $1 billion found in 2013, these are 15 of the most incredible discoveries from World War II. Number 15. Paintings worth over $1 billion were discovered in 2013. During the Nazi regime, artwork that the party deemed to be depictions of immorality was banned. The prohibition of degenerate art gave Nazi officials an excuse to seize paintings, purportedly to destroy them, but in reality to hoard them for a day when their value could be exploited. Hildebrand Gerlit was a minor Nazi official in Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry who built an extensive collection of such works, as well as those simply seized from Jewish families and facilities. Among them were paintings by Chagall, Picasso, and Henri Matisse. Nearly all of the paintings had long been believed to have been destroyed by Allied bombing when German police discovered them in early 2012. There were more than 1,200 paintings in the cache. When Hildebrand died, the paintings he had collected were taken by his son, who kept them hidden in his Munich apartment. The paintings were not on display, but secreted in a back room of the apartment, which had been used as a storeroom. German police arrested the son, Cornelius Hildebrand, after he was acting suspiciously on a train, and under interrogation, the hidden artwork was revealed. Since the realization of the paintings, the German authorities have attempted to identify their rightful owners to ensure that more than $1 billion worth of irreplaceable artwork is returned. Cornelius Hildebrand died in 2014 after telling the German magazine Der Spiegel of his desire to resolve the case so that he could get the paintings back, which he believed to be rightfully his own. Number 14. A Soviet T-34 tank was discovered in the Don River in Russia in 2015. The Soviet T-34 battle tank nearly changed the course of the war on the Eastern Front when it was first deployed in 1941. German armored tactics master Heinz Guderian claimed that the Soviet tank possessed vast superiority over the German armor it opposed. German forces invading the Soviet Union were stunned at the power of the T-34, and had it not been for inept Soviet leadership in the early days of the invasion, as well as the Germans converting their fabled 88mm guns to serve as anti-tank weapons, the Soviets could well have repulsed the Germans sooner. The Soviet tank played a key role in the encirclement and reduction of the German Sixth Army in the Battle of Stalingrad, a major turning point of the war. In 2015, divers in the Don River in the Voronezh Oblast region discovered an intact Soviet T-34 sitting upright on the riverbed. Heavy fighting occurred in the area during the Stalingrad campaign, and speculation was that the tank, which was likely built at the Stalingrad tractor plant, fell into the river as it tried to cross a temporary bridge. The bridge was unable to support the tank's 30 tons. The river where the vehicle was discovered was too deep for it to have attempted to cross by fording. After the discovery, the tank was first checked for human remains, and none having been found, it was hauled out of the Don by the Russian military. It was in such good condition after its long soak in the river that Patriot Park, a military museum near Moscow, initiated discussions to restore it to running condition. Number 13. Royal Air Force Flight Sergeant Dennis Copping and his P-40 Kitty Hawk. On June 28, 1942, 24-year-old Flight Sergeant Dennis Copping was ordered to fly a damaged Kitty Hawk between bases in the Egyptian desert to have it repaired. When Copping did not arrive at his destination, it was assumed that the aircraft had been shot down by either the Germans or the Italians. An air search revealed no trace of the lost aircraft or its pilot, and Flight Sergeant Copping became a casualty of the air war, believed to be killed in action for the next 7 decades. In May of 2012, a well-preserved P-40 with RAF markings was discovered in the desert sands by Polish oil workers, as well as a parachute. Some weeks earlier, human skeletal remains had been discovered nearby. They were later identified as those of Flight Sergeant Copping, and it was determined that the pilot had survived the crash landing and died subsequently from exposure or thirst. From the damaged aircraft, which has been restored and is on display at the El Alamein Museum in Egypt, it was determined that Copping survived the crash landing, which was likely caused by his running out of fuel. A severe sandstorm caused the pilot to become disoriented and off course, and the lack of landmarks to guide the pilot led him far off his desired flight path. The airplane flew on until the pilot was forced to put it down in the desert sands, after which he discarded his parachute and began walking. The sandstorms covered the plane and later uncovered it again, allowing it to be found by the Polish workers more than 200 miles from any town or village. The displayed airplane in Egypt bears no mention of Flight Sergeant Dennis Copping. Number 12. The German battleship Bismarck still displays the swastika symbol as it lies on the ocean floor. The German battleship Bismarck had a short career, but it remains one of the great sagas of the sea. On its first voyage, it eluded British detection long enough to approach the Atlantic sea lanes via the Denmark Strait, where it engaged and sank the British battlecruiser Hood, the most powerful ship of the Royal Navy, severely damaging the new battleship Prince of Wales. Winston Churchill ordained that the German ship be sunk at all costs and diverted ships meant to protect precious convoys to the chase. Bismarck had sustained damage too and was losing oil, which forced the massive vessel to head for the French coast for protection by the Luftwaffe. The British closed in, and a combination of aerial torpedoes, destroyer attacks, bombardment by the battleships King George V and Rodney, and finally, torpedo fire from cruisers sank the ship. German survivors, which were few as the Royal Navy left the scene out of concern over U-boats, leaving many survivors in the frigid water, claimed that they had sunk their own ship using scuttling charges. On June 8, 1989, an expedition led by Dr. Robert Ballard found the wreck of the ship, and extensive undersea surveillance of the wreck and the nearby site indicated that the claims of the German crewmen were likely true. A subsequent Russian expedition yielded similar results in 2001. All evidence points to the German battleship, which was completely wrecked topside, being sunk by scuttling, and British shells or torpedoes did not penetrate its armored citadel. The ship sits upright on the side of a mountain, and the swastika painted on its foredeck is still clearly visible to undersea visitors. Number 11. A carrier pigeon and its secret message was found in a Surrey home in 2012. During the Second World War, as late as 1957, the U.S. and other armies used carrier pigeons to send messages between various units and sites. When a pigeon carrying a message from the front arrived at its coop, it would sound an alarm, and the message was removed from the capsule attached to the bird's leg and sent along via radio, messenger, or signal telegraph. The messages were in code, and members of the Signal Corps manned the coops to decode them. Of course, the enemy knew the pigeons' purpose well, and attempts to shoot them down were common. Trained hawks were used to attack them. Numerous pigeons were awarded the Dickon Medal, a British award for animals for exemplary service to the military. Another use of pigeons was communication with spies behind the enemy lines, with the birds flying directly to the spy's contact, or handler, in the United Kingdom during the years of the war before the liberation of France. The spies often had their own unique codes, known only to them and their contacts. It was likely one such pigeon, or rather, the remains of one such pigeon, which a Surrey homeowner discovered as he cleaned out a long disused chimney in 2012. What looked like a twig was the skeletal remains of a pigeon's leg, with the red message canister still attached. The pigeon had been lodged in the chimney since World War II. 2. Although some claim to have decoded the message privately, in 2016, The British government communications headquarters announced that decoding was impossible without access to the original source code. Number 10. The Japanese I-400 submarine class was designed to launch aircraft. During the war, the Japanese devised a class of submarines from which 3 aircraft could be launched against targets after the vessel surfaced, making them, in essence, submerged aircraft carriers. The Japanese developed plans to use the vessels in an attack on the Panama Canal, going so far as rehearsing the mission in waters off Japan. Later, they planned to use them in a surprise attack on the American fleet anchorage at Ulithi, but the war ended while the mission was still in the planning phase. When the Japanese surrendered, the 3 completed I-400 class submarines were taken by the Americans, many of whom were stupefied by the sheer size of the vessels. When the Soviets demanded the right to inspect captured Japanese submarines of all classes, the Americans decided that they did not want the advanced Japanese technology in the hands of Stalin, who was proving stubborn. The U.S. Navy removed the submarines to classified positions and sank them, with several, including the I-400 and I-401, being sunk by torpedoes from the USS Trumpetfish, which was ordered not to report the exact location of the sinking. In March 2005, the I-401 was discovered in the waters of Hawaii. In 2013, the I-400 was discovered by the same research team from the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory, southwest of Oahu. The massive Japanese submarines had remained undetected since June of 1946. Number 9. Germany's only aircraft carrier was discovered in 2006 after being lost for over 60 years. German Grand Admiral Erich Raeder had plans for a great German navy to rival the British in the years before World War II. Still, Adolf Hitler was not particularly interested in naval affairs beyond the use of U-boats. In 1938, Raeder informed the Führer that Germany's new aircraft carrier, Graf Zeppelin, was nearing completion and would be finished the following year. By 1943, it was not, and growing pressure from Hermann Göring to end the project, he did not want to surrender the control of any air forces to the Navy, ensured that the ship would not be finished. In 1943, work on the ship was suspended, and the unfinished vessel was towed from one port to another, and at one point it was used as a store ship. When the war ended, the hull was still incomplete, though the vessel could be towed, and finishing the ship was a distinct possibility. The Soviets took the vessel and other German warships, which fell into their hands, and several reports of its ultimate fate were issued. Some claimed it was sunk off Peenemünde, while others said it sank after striking a mine while towing to Leningrad. Still, another claimed it was sunk on August 16, 1947, following a series of planned detonations. In July 2006, a wreck was discovered by a research vessel owned by the Polish oil company Petrobaltic, and subsequent surveys conducted by the Polish Navy identified the wreck as the remains of the Graf Zeppelin, to a degree of certainty, according to the Poles, of 99%. Number 8. A B-24 bomber was found 74 years after being shot down in the Pacific War. Heaven Can Wait was the name the crew of a B-24D heavy bomber gave their aircraft, which in 1944 was involved in the heavy fighting in New Guinea. On March 11, 1944, the aircraft was part of a mission to bomb Japanese anti-aircraft batteries on the northern coast of New Guinea in the area of Hansa Bay. The B-24 carried a crew of 11, and the crew of Heaven Can Wait had been in the area for just 4 months before their mission of March 11th. After hitting targets of opportunity, after finding their assigned target obscured by clouds, Heaven Can Wait was on its return leg when it encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire. The airplane began to break apart in the air, losing its tail section before crashing into the sea, where it burned on the surface before sinking beneath. The crew of the lost bomber was declared killed in action on the same day, based on the eyewitness accounts of other flyers who observed the crash. In October 2017, after an 11-day search and considering the accounts of eyewitnesses who reported the loss of the airplane in 1944, the wreckage of a B-24 was found at a depth of just over 210 feet in the area reported as the crash site. The wreckage was surveyed by a remotely operated vehicle, and the result of the survey and supporting data led to the conclusion that the wreck was the remains of Heaven Can Wait, more than 70 years after the bomber and the 11 men in it plunged to the bottom of the sea. Number 7. The USS Juno was the ship that carried the 5 Sullivan brothers. The United States Navy light cruiser Juno was engaged in the naval battle of Guadalcanal when it was heavily damaged by a torpedo launched by a Japanese destroyer. The following morning, November 13, 1942, the damaged cruiser was steaming in company with 2 other cruisers when it was again torpedoed, that time by a Japanese submarine. Juno broke in half and sank in less than a minute, and the violence of the explosion convinced the commanders of the other cruisers that there could not possibly have been survivors. The more than 100 survivors in the water clung to wreckage and rafts as they grimly watched the American warships steam away in the distance. Only 10 would survive and be rescued. Among the dead were the 5 Sullivan brothers. The sinking of the Juno and the loss of the Sullivans became a war propaganda coup for the U.S. Navy when the film The Fighting Sullivans was released, and a destroyer was named in their honor. The Navy kept quiet about the fact that at least 2 of the brothers were among the sailors who survived the initial sinking, and several of the men who did survive claimed they had seen 3 of the brothers alive in the water. In March of 2018, on St. Patrick's Day, the wreck of the ship on which the 5 brothers had served was discovered on the ocean floor by a team led by Paul Allen and Robert Kraft. The ship is over 2.5 miles beneath the surface near the Solomon Islands, a war grave for the nearly 800 men who perished in it, and the waters of the Pacific after it sank. Number 6. The wreck of USS Yorktown was discovered in 1998, 3 miles beneath the surface of the Pacific. USS Yorktown was one of the 7 United States aircraft carriers in commission when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, though the ship was in the Atlantic. By the middle of December, Yorktown was steaming for the Pacific, and in January, the ship was the center of a task force conducting nuisance raids against Japanese-held islands as the United States opened offensive operations. In May 1942, Yorktown was part of the American forces that took part in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Struck by a bomb that caused heavy damage, the ship limped back to Pearl Harbor, leaking oil with serious damage to its engine rooms and boilers. Initial estimates were that it would take 3 months of shipyard availability before the ship would be ready to resume operations. 3 days after arriving at Pearl Harbor, Yorktown was again underway, with repairmen still aboard to assist in the defense of Midway Atoll. During the battle there in the first week of June 1942, Yorktown's planes destroyed the Japanese carrier Soryu, but retaliatory Japanese attacks heavily damaged the American carrier. The ship was abandoned, reboarded, and abandoned again. A repair crew was aboard when the Japanese submarine I-168 torpedoed the ship. After several hours, Yorktown finally sank on June 7th. 141 of its crew had died in the battle. In 1998, Dr. Robert Ballard and his team discovered the wreck, who reported the ship resting upright on the bottom of the sea in excellent condition, with much of the ship's gear recognizable to the explorers. Lüneburg was the location where Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler committed suicide while in custody of the British Army. Himmler killed himself using a cyanide capsule after it was clear that the British knew who he was and before they were able to interrogate him fully. Several other SS officers and their aides were captured in the area during the confused final days of the war and immediately following the German surrender. Who stashed the cache of gold coins, 217 in all, remains a mystery. but they were likely looted from their original owners and hidden as a hedge, possibly to aid in escaping the Allied authorities via the rat lines set up through Western Europe. Himmler was buried in an unmarked location near where the coins were discovered. Number 2. A nearly intact German fighter airplane was found at the bottom of a Russian lake. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 was a workhorse of the German Luftwaffe throughout the Second World War, serving on the Western and Eastern fronts, and in North Africa, the skies over England, and along the Atlantic European coastline. It was a major component of the German Blitzkrieg, which launched the war, and a scourge for the Allied bombers, which flew missions over targets over Europe. One Bf-109, which was built in 1939, flew against the Allies during the Battle of France and against the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain, later being transferred to the east to take part in the invasion of the Soviet Union. Flown there by Wolf-Dietrich Widowitz, who earned 36 victories in the war, it was damaged in combat with a Soviet Hurricane and forced to land on a frozen lake. Widowitz was unhurt and evaded capture. As the ice thawed, the airplane sank beneath the lake's surface, settling to the bottom where it remained until 2003, when it was discovered and brought to the surface in nearly perfect condition, other than the battle damage to the engine, which had forced it down. The airplane was sent to California for preservation. The pilot was killed later in the war, attempting to make another forced landing of a damaged aircraft. According to some aviation websites, another Bf-109 was found in a Russian lake, forced to land in similar circumstances in 1944 and salvaged in 2018. Other German fighter planes have been located in various locations 3/4 of a century after they were lost in action. Another Messerschmitt and the remains of the pilot were found in Denmark in 2017. Family lore for the Danish Christiansen family included the story of a German fighter plane crashing on their farm during the Second World War. When a metal detector deployed by the Danish farmer and his son began signaling the presence of something deep in the marshy ground, an excavator was employed. At a depth of about 15 feet, the remains of a wrecked airplane began to be exposed for the first time in decades. The airplane was not recognizable as such, being mostly wreckage, though the aircraft's engine was mostly intact. So was ammunition for the fighters' guns, which made further excavation somewhat dangerous, and specialists were called in to remove the remainder of the wreckage. They also found bone fragments and tattered clothing worn by the pilot. A book, which the farmer identified to the BBC as either a little Bible or it was Mein Kampf, and a wallet containing intact paper currency was found. All of the personal items were placed in the hands of the proper authorities, and forensic experts were called in to attempt to identify the pilot as well as recover all of the human remains. From the engine, it was determined that the downed German airplane was a Messerschmitt Bf-109. On March 24, 2017, it was announced that the pilot of the German plane was Hans Wunderlich, 19 years of age at the time of his fatal flight, which occurred sometime in April 1940. Number 1. The Yora Creek battlefield was discovered in New Guinea in 2010. Yora Creek was the site of 2 fierce battles between the Japanese in New Guinea and Australian troops, the first in August and September 1942 and the second the following month. The first Australian forces were making a fighting withdrawal before the Japanese, who had landed in Papua earlier in the summer. The site of the 2 engagements was well known to historians and locals, but not until 2010 was an extension of the battlefield discovered by the Western world. Well known to local natives, its existence had been kept quiet by them out of respect for the dead and fear of their spirits should the site where they fell be disturbed. The discovery included the remains of fallen soldiers on both sides of the war. The Yora Creek battlefield extended the fighting further downstream, where the Australians gained their first victory of the Kokoda Track campaign at the second of the 2 battles fought there. When a former Australian commando discovered it, it was reported that the field remained as it was when the fighting ceased, with human remains lying where they had fallen. However, some had been disturbed by wildlife. The scene was littered with weapons, military paraphernalia, such as helmets and spent magazines, discarded weapons, unexploded hand grenades, and other indications of the savagery of the combat that took place there in 1942. Which of these discoveries intrigued you the most? Let us know in the comments section below.